tell me about other experiences, other people, other interactions or ideas that influenced your thinking and developing your theories about validation?
Well, when I first came back in '63, I guess this man, his name was Isidore Rose, and he was in his early 80s when I met him, and he was in the special service department that my father had started, but he was not disoriented. But no one wanted him around because he swore. So everyone that nobody wanted around, they put in the special service department. He would have a cane, and he would swear, and he would say, and I'm going to swear now, okay? God damn son of a bitch. He said that my father castrated him in the attic. And so this was my father. I was really motivated to have him change his mind. And I worked with him for 10 years, from '63 to '73. And I took him to the attic, and I said, look around, Mr. Rose, there's no knife, there's no blood. And he wouldn't look, he had his eyes closed. I had to lead him downstairs. I tried behavior modification. I had a small group, because that was my background. And he was in the group, and he liked the group because we talked to him. No one else would say anything because he swore so much. Well, I said, if you keep swearing, you can't come back to my group because you're really frightening everybody. And he swore more. I tried redirection, diversion, all kinds of stuff, and nothing really helped. He just got worse and worse and withdrew inward. And what happened in 1968, my father retired. I met him in '63. And in '68, he stopped walking, and he could have walked. And he stopped talking, and he could have talked. And they brought him to my group in his wheelchair. And he would have his eyes closed, and we have movies of him doing this. And with his fingers, he would walk back and forth on the rod, on the arm of his chair, and he would say, Buckeye in 105th, Buckeye in 105th, damn judge. I ignored him. I didn't know. And then in 1972, he stopped moving. They gave him medication, and he stopped moving, and he became a living dead person. In 1973, he died. So he was the first person who really taught, and after he died, I met his sister, and she told me when he was very little, they came to America during a depression. They were poor. His father locked him in the attic to punish him for things he didn't do, and his father said to him, you'll never amount to anything. And he listened to his dad, and and he never did amount to very much. He was impotent, his wife divorced him. And I found out that Buckeye in 105th is the street that he walked to practice his law. He had his law office. But he never said anything. He was always meek and mild. And he had one big case. It was like the Lewinsky case was really very famous, and the judge ruled against him. So what he was doing in 1968, when he could still talk, he was punishing the judge, damn judge. And he was walking back on Buckeye in 105th and redoing his big law case. If I had said to him, Mr. Rose, what did that bitch do to you? I didn't have to swear, but I could have picked up his anger. How bad did he hurt you? Because I learned about symbols from this man, that my father was a symbol in validation, is a substitute, someone in present time that substitutes for the past. That my father was a substitute for his father, because my father was the male authority in this home, like his father was his male authority. And what he was doing, finally, he was telling him off. His anger was coming out, and I learned about the resolution struggle, not only from him, but he was the first one, that when people get really old and they have really strong issues that they haven't faced their whole life, and the controls loosen because of deterioration of the brain, these feelings come out. So that validation is really a holistic model. You don't just look at the brain. The brain is important, because if the brain were okay, people would be controlled and they wouldn't express any feelings. But with the deterioration of the brain, these feelings come out, and someone has to listen. And I did not listen to him. But when I did start listening and pick up the emotions, people felt better, and their anger lessened. So when one man who had been henpecked from his wife, his whole life, and I knew what she did, and he was going like this. And when I picked up his anger, I said, Mr. Drosser, you are so angry. And he said, yeah, and his anger escalated, and I went with it. And after it reached a peak, he came down. and his anger lessened.
Naomi, are there other patient stories that have been transformative for you? Share those with us.
I remember Elizabeth Gogolick. She was a secretary or bookkeeper for General Electric her whole life. And when she was retired at age 65, she didn't want to be retired, so she took her Underwood typewriter to her house. And every morning at 9 o'clock, she put on her hat and coat. She went into her living room. She worked for General Electric, and she took off her hat and coat. Her daughter told me this. When she came to the home, she was in her, I think, early 80s. She couldn't bring her typewriter because it was all rusted, but she brought her pocketbook, which was her, I can't think of the name, it was her filing cabinet. And she knew she was living in the home, but she was still working for General Electric. She was what we call successfully maloriented. By maloriented, we mean in validation, unhappily oriented, because you're holding on to something that isn't there anymore. You're not able to roll with the punches of aging. Well, she couldn't roll with the punches of aging, but she was happy. She would take her pocketbook and she would say to the other ladies and men, "Excuse me, is the company meeting here today?" And the other people would say, "Cuckoo." She never heard them. She's a wonderful denier. She would run away and she'd say, "Oh, it'll be tomorrow." And finally she met a friend, and the two of them were working for General Electric together. And every morning they would meet. We had a great big red velvet love seat. And they would be meeting at like 6 o'clock. And then at 8 o'clock they'd go to breakfast. They were all working. We had a lot of groups in the home. They were in all of the groups working for General Electric. Well, her friend died. And she wouldn't leave this love seat. And the other people said, "Isabel, go to bed." She said, "I am waiting for my friend." And the other people said, "Isabel, your friend is dead." And suddenly reality hit her for a moment. She knew that her friend died. She knew this was not her filing cabinet. She knew that she wasn't working for General Electric. And she took off all her clothes and she said, "Oh, there's Larry. Larry." Larry was an old lover who had abandoned her many years ago. And I worked with Mrs. Gogolick. She was in my group, and she was, afterwards, she became the bookkeeper, the secretary for my group. And the nurse at that time put diapers on everybody. They didn't need it, but she did, because it was easier. So Mrs. Gogolick would take off the diapers. I said, "What are you doing, Mrs. Gogolick?" Well, she was folding envelopes. The diapers were her envelopes. Mm-hmm. And she would say, "Oh, I have to mail this right away." And I entered into her world, Mrs. Gogolick and I. And she never, she told me about her lover, but she was together. She was still denying. But she was the secretary until she died. Mrs. Gogolick was talking, interacting, and feeling useful. So I learned from Mrs. Gogolick, well, first that people need to hold on to their identity, that some people can't give it up, and that the worker has to go with the person wherever they are. So when she was looking for her lover, I was with her at every stage. So that's what she taught me, yeah. There was a man who was a physician, very famous physician, and he kept calling his wife, "Sophie," and she never came. Well, she was oriented, so I said, "Mrs. His name was Applebaum, why don't you ever visit your husband?" And she said, "He's a very cold man. He never touched me." She said they had no sex. They had one child. I don't know how they managed, but they did. And when he came into my group, he started goosing all the ladies. And one day I said to him, "How do you do, Dr. Applebaum?" And he said, "I am not Dr. Applebaum. Dr. Applebaum is in his office practicing medicine." I said, "If you're not Dr. Applebaum, who are you?" And he said, "Leave me alone. I am very occupied." And he was expressing his sexual feelings for the first time. So then again I learned that if this man had expressed his sexual feelings when he was a young man, he wouldn't have had to goose the ladies as an old man. So that this is a combination of brain deterioration because his brain wasn't telling him anymore where his body was. His sensory cells were so deteriorated that he didn't know that he was here. So he was able to take Dr. Applebaum, put him in his office with his mind's eye, practicing medicine, and he could express his sexual needs. Well, one day, in the middle of the group, he took off his pants, took out his penis, and he said, "Here I am." And I didn't know what to do. I was mortified. But I knew that Mrs. Freeman, who never knew where she was. I mean, I kept wanting her to say the day and the date, and she never did. One day she greeted everybody and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we all have Flumpkin-Baggins disease. It's a disease of old age. When you get old, you have good imagination and smelly piss." And she sat down, and that was her greeting. Now, this was a high-class lady. She had just been to the bathroom. She had made that observation. She was sharing it with everyone, and she sat down. She never said the day and the date. But she had a wisdom I did not have. So when Dr. Applebaum did this, I said, "Mrs. Freeman, look at Dr. Applebaum. What are we going to do?" And she looked, and she said, "Oh, you must have been a good husband," she said. "You must have made your wife so happy." And he zipped right up. So I always put Dr. Applebaum next to a woman who also missed her husband. And in the validation group, you can sing love songs and you can kiss. And he never exposed himself anymore because his need to express his sexual feelings were met in this group in a very socially acceptable way. So a validation group can do a whole lot that you can't do individually. And the people have a wisdom with each other that they express in a group. And this goes very deep. Like, I worked in the South, and half of the people in my group were black and half were white. Well, there was no bit of prejudice in this group. The humanity in people is there, and it goes beyond race and religion, and people know what to do. They know how to relate to each other, and I learned from them. So people never lose any personhood. It's always there.
Yes.
It just has to be brought out, because people can't bring it out. Most people who are disoriented cannot do this by themselves. They need somebody to elicit this wisdom or poetry, because people, as you know, become very poetic. As they lose logical thinking, the poetry comes out. People freely associate one thing with another. It's just wonderful.
Tell me from your experience why you believe personhood persists in in elderly people with Alzheimer's disease.
Well, I don't think it's ever lost. It's so people always have that innate, if you want to call it personhood or knowing, intuitive knowing, wisdom. And that's Katie, who is now in medical school. And that's Lena, who is a psychologist and works in London. England.
Really?
Mm-hmm. So that's your family. And what happens is when people lose their controls and they don't know where they are anymore, this personhood comes out and flowers. It couldn't flower before because people were too busy doing their thing and being controlled by society and doing what they thought they should do. But now, for example, we were singing Daisy, Daisy, and this lady, every time we got to the word crazy, she'd stop singing. And it was so weird. One day, I looked at her, and she looked back at me, and she explained, and she said, it's better to be crazy, because then it doesn't matter what you do. And so she knew she was losing it. She said, what the heck, I'll go with the flow. So people know they're losing their cognitive capacity. And first they worry about it. Like Mrs. Gogolick was worried about first not remembering, because I saw her through all these transitions. And then she just, people accept it and say, okay, this is me. And then the me comes out. One lady who had just gotten this mini mental test, she said to me, that young man, he doesn't know who the president is. He asked me to tell him. Well, I didn't tell him. He has good eyes. Why doesn't he read a newspaper? When Bush wanted to be reelected, he came to an assisted living. And he sees this little lady, and he said, Madam, do you know who I am? And the little old lady says, no, but if you go to the front desk, they'll tell you who you are. a very famous lawyer, Mr. Bartlett. He kept asking for his mother. And I said, Mr. Bartlett, your mother is no longer alive. You're 90 years old. And he straightened up and he said, oh, yes, she is. My mother is alive on a technicality. And there, one lady, just one more story. And these are people who don't know where they are. They didn't know my name. Some of them didn't even know their own name. They could never pass a mini mental test. One lady, she was so happy. And she was very, very old. And I said, Mrs. Smith, what happened? You look so happy. And she said, oh, I just had the most wonderful conversation with my mother and my aunt. I didn't have the heart to tell them that they were dead. Well, you see the levels of knowing? So it's that deep level that people never ever lose, but that's very often the adult child never knows is there. And that's why they say they've lost their personhood, but they never did. They've lost their logical thinking, they've lost their chronological thinking, but they have intuitive knowing.
Naomi, we encounter people all the time, as you do, who think that they are losing their loved one. What advice can you give individuals about how to reach that person again, to convince them that the person is still there? How would you recommend that we?
Well, the first thing is to listen and not to argue. If someone says, I have to see my mother, not to argue and say your mother's dead, or not to lie and say your mother's alive. Because deep down, that person knows their mother is dead. I mean, I was there when she died, and that was traumatic. That's buried. But right now, I have to see my mother. So to know that they're basic human needs that people express, and to relate to the needs. So if I have to go see my mother, that means either I'm scared to be alone without my mom, or I never separated, or I have unresolved issues. I never told her, Mom, you hurt me. I never expressed some really strong feelings, and now I need to do it. And I have a mind's eye, and I can restore my mother to meet my human need. So that's one human need, is to be safe, to be warm, to be nurtured, to be loved, and to resolve your unfinished issues. And if someone is, for example, pounding, if a son says, my dad's nuts, all day long he goes like this, oh no sir, he's not nuts. Your father does not see his hand. His brain is very deteriorated, he doesn't know this is his hand. Also, he doesn't see well. But you know, your dad sees a hammer. He was a master carpenter. And he sees a nail, and he sees wood. Your father is working. He's restoring his identity. He never learned to be an old man in a wheelchair. He's going to die a master carpenter. So if the son learns, if the son asks Dad, what are you doing? Maybe the dad can't answer because he has no more words. But if the son asks the dad, Dad, is it oak or pine? Eyes open. Solid oak, not cheap pine. Because my granddad taught me about woods. Because there are those words, those woods are stored permanently. I have a love. There are certain words that are there, and all you have to do is give the person choices. Is it oak? Is it pine? Solid oak. And we have a communication. Is it a 12 by 4 or a 13? If you ask me how big it is, I can't answer. But you give me choices. And the son and the dad will have a communication. And the father will never become a living dead person. He will communicate. When people smear their words together, they say the fitzel and the tittle never went on the tip, but that is why I didn't tittle. This happened very, like one lady, she'd always say, help. And then I found out that she wanted help from heaven because her mother was in heaven. Her mother always helped her when she needed her. And Mrs. Gogolick used to say, this is a fluid fluoride invention. And she could still talk, so I asked her, what do you mean, Mrs. Gogolick, fluid fluoride? It's not English. So she says, watery. Your eyes look watery, like you want to cry. And I was sad because she was losing her speech. Fluid fluoride, flowing, watery tears. She said, when she said, this is a simophile contabulation in the Fendula Company. What is Fendula, Mrs. Gogolick? She said, memorable friends from the past If you put your fingers here and you say Fendela and then memorable friends from the past, you find the movement of tongue, teeth, and lips are very similar with Fendela and memorable friends from the past. It's no longer Webster's classified dictionary meaning. Now it's how words feel. It's the movement of tongue and teeth and lips that give new people. There's always, I think the most important principle is there's always a meaning, a good meaning behind what people do. So when someone can't say words anymore, we twiddled and we went on that, there's something there. People want to communicate, but they don't have any words. So that's when we use a technique called ambiguity. You have to be really convinced that this is not gibberish. Or sometimes the neurologist will say it's a schizophrenic word salad. No, there's always a good reason behind. So if someone says, oh, we went up and we went down, prepositions and numbers are still there. So if you say, were there two? If you say how many, people can't answer. But if you ask, are there 2 or 3? There were 3 doubles, but I told those others to go fiddle with their tiddles, and they didn't work. Were you inside? Prepositions are still there. Or outside. If you ask, where were you? Person can't think, but were you inside or outside? They can choose. We were inside, and we went out in the tiddle, but we had such a nice little fiddle. And there was a wonderful communication. Sometimes you never know what the person has said, but sometimes you do when things come out. But one thing I learned, one man once said, the fits of the tips went tum-tum. And I mirrored it exactly. I said, the fits of the tips went tum-tum. And the man said, what's the matter with you? So people know, you don't pick up these word doodles or word combinations. You pick up a few dictionary words that are there. You pick up the human need, the emotion, and you can add prepositions and numbers, and you will communicate with the people. And that happened very often. And finally, I looked at the literature, and I found Piaget, the Swiss psychologist, and he studied how we learn to talk. And he found out that movement always comes before speech. What he meant is, if my mom goes, I'm a little infant, a baby, and I want my mother. Idea, she rocked me. So I mimic her movement. And now the movement is my mother. I don't cry. I get a little older, I look, now she's here. Very old people go sometimes. They're not babies, but they're old people, very old, who go back to what they learned when they were very little, which is a very important principle in validation, that when you learn when you're very little, that has emotions attached, with kisses and hugs and smacks, that's permanently imprinted. You can never erase it. The intellectual, cognitive, verbal learning, that sometimes goes at very old age, but the emotional learning, that stays. So I have my mother. And then the child goes to school, and now my logical thinking centers are developed, and I can classify. A mother belongs into a category of females with children. It's not my own mother. It's abstract, classified, stored in my left brain. But now I'm an old lady, and my left brain is deteriorated, and I want my mother. So what do? I go back to the concrete. Mama, mama, mama. And the other old people say, shut up, you old pig. And the validation worker links the movement to the human need. She needs her mother. And this is what the adult child can do. So if a person can't talk anymore but uses movement to express human needs, you go to the human need.
Tell me some of the individuals who helped you formulate your ideas that you use in validation.
Well, most important was my mom and dad. But more than that, it was Freud, whom I studied and whom I learned that people have a deep level of knowing. Someone call it subconscious. So you never lie to the person, because deep down people know the truth. And it was Jung, Carl Jung, who wrote about symbols. And that's when Mr. Rose used my father as a substitute, I realized that people use symbols, they become very creative. They lose the as if. A woman who's kissing her hand, this is her baby. Her hand becomes a symbol. It feels soft, as if it were her baby. So then the poetry comes out. Like a poet will say, my hand is a tree. But a poet knows the difference between a hand and a tree. But an old person who can't classify anymore, has lost the logical thinking, they have the poetry, and so the hand becomes the baby. So Jung helped Wilder Penfield, who stimulated, in the temporal lobe. And he was doing his neurosurgery, and the man began to smell bread baking when he was a baby, and he stimulated all the smells and the sights, and Marcel Proust wrote about that, all things remembered. So this is not a hallucination. A hallucination is a psychosis. If I were 50 years old, it would be a psychosis, maybe. But if I'm 90 and I see this man, and I say, there he is, and I'm shaking, something happened to me. Maybe I was raped, and I told my mom. She said, don't you ever say that. Your uncle is a fine man, and smacked me. So I swallowed my pain, my hurt, my shame, my fear for all these years, 88 years, and now with my mind's eye, I see this man, maybe not my uncle, because Mom said he was a wonderful man, but maybe the man on TV, maybe the caregiver that's coming to wash me. You get away from me. And the validating caregiver doesn't know I was raped, because my kids probably wouldn't know and wouldn't say, but knows that I am not psychotic. Something happened to me, and I need to express these feelings now. So that came from Freud and Jung and Penfield, Karen Horney, whom I studied a lot at that. This is all old, they don't do that anymore, about siblings' rivalry and inferiority complexes. And I learned that, like Miss Isidore Rose, who felt inferior his whole life, and now he was getting back. And there was one man who would always say, shut up, shut up. They were going to medicate him. And I put him in, I found out he was the youngest of 11 children. And they always told him to shut up. So he became the shutter-upper. I gave him a gavel. And at the end of the meeting, when people had to be quiet anyway, I said, here, Mr. Jones, here it is, shut up. And everybody shut up. And he didn't say shut up anymore, and they didn't medicate him. So one of the goals of validation is less medication and as independent functioning as possible. So if I see a man, that doesn't mean I have to go to a nursing home or an assisted living. If you validate me and if you help me talk about this man, the feeling, I guess that's the most important principle in validation, is what feelings are expressed. And someone listens with empathy, they're relieved. And in a few weeks, I may not see that man anymore. I'm not cured because it's too late for insight. And I've tried it with many people to give people that aha. Now I know why I see the man. It's because I was raped when I was 8 years old. Oh no, people cannot do that. I've tried and tried. So you have to accept the person where they are. And that's basic social work principles you learn, to accept people where they are. My father wrote about this in the 50s. So the basic social work principles help me, the values, that everyone has a dignity and you don't argue with people and you're with people where they are at the moment. Existentialism a little bit, because it is existential. You're with that person at that moment. I read R.D. Laing, who wrote The Divided Self. He did a lot of work with schizophrenics. The idea that this is another part of a human being that wants to live, to spring forth.
The video that you made with Gladys Wilson, which has basically gone viral and has touched so many people about how you interacted with this woman, has really been inspiring to me in what I do. Let me turn that around a little bit and ask you, if you were a nursing home resident like Gladys Wilson, what would you want people to know about you? How would you want people to interact with you if you were in that condition?
Well, first I'd want them to know that I was born in Germany. I'd want them to know some German songs, because if I can't talk anymore, I can sing. Those early, I can't sing Beastie Boys or Backstreet Boys, but songs that I learned when I was little, that's there. And so there's an immediate connection if you learn the songs in German. You'd have to, even though I was been in America for many years, people go back. So if you sing Auf die Adrian bin gefahren, I will relate to you. I don't know who you are, but you're part of me. And we become one person for that moment. But also, I'd like you to know the work that I did, because a lot of people who are in repetitive motion act out their work through their movements. So if I'm pounding, or if I was a farmer, and you see me doing this, you would ask me, are they Guernsey, or are they milk for milk, or do you use them for beef? We have a relationship, even though I don't speak very well. Those sleeping brain cells will wake up. I'd like you to know if I was married. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning.
Give me a little kiss. Okay. Thank you. Now, some people who had unhappy marriages, that's why I call people by their last names, unless they want to be called by their first names, because it gives a certain dignity. So if I didn't want to be married and you said, hello, Mrs. Feil, I would say, it's a Miss Feil. And you would say, you were never married? I wouldn't have them on a silver platter. And you learn more about me. Or if I was Miss Kelly, oh, Miss Kelly, you're Irish. When Irish eyes are smiling, we have a relationship. So where I was born, if I was married, the kind of work that I did, if you could learn my relationship with my children, how many children I have, the kind of a mother I was. If my children visit me a lot, you'd kind of have an idea that I was good, there was love there. If they never visit me, something went wrong. And so that if I'm sitting there crying a lot, you know, you're so sad, you pick up my feelings. And if you know my children's names, if you ask me what is their names, I wouldn't know, but you tell me what their names are, and it'll come out. If you say, is it Vicky? Oh, and then we have a relationship. Of course, how old I was, you want to know my medical history. And if I had a psychiatric history, you'd want to know that. Because if I see the man up there, and I never had any history of psychiatric illness, you know I'm seeing someone from my mind's eye. But if you know I had a history of mental illness and I was diagnosed schizophrenic when I was 30, then it's a little different.
It's almost as if these essential elements of who you were, your personhood,
Yeah.
are still there and can be used to build relationship with you in your present moment.
Right. Sometimes, not always. Mm-hmm. Like with Gladys Wilson, unfortunately, I did not know her history. I had never seen her before. But I did know about touch, that if you touch someone where your mom touched you, that triggers memories of mother. And I did know that in her culture, the gospel songs are very important, and they trigger memories of God and love and mother and nurturing. Mm-hmm. So those are very important. So when people are in what we call repetitive motion, when they use movements and they have no more speech, relating to knowing touch, you know, where to touch the person. If it was my husband, it would be here, and if it was a child, if I was a farmer, you might touch me here, and the calf of the foot, people respond. And the music, that's important to me. If I come from another country, you have to learn a Chinese lullaby. Mm-hmm. So that's important. Right. You asked what are the hard things. The hard was the administration of the home. He would have staff meetings, this administrator, and he would tell the staff about me. He would say, she's as crazy as the people she works with. So that when you have a group, a validation group, it's very important you give social roles. Like Mrs. Freeman was the welcomer. You have people who don't walk at all. They will get up and walk. They're the hostess. I was always a hostess. I always had parties. I had a lot of kids. So you make me I need help to walk. But a hostess is very important. So you need cookies, and you need a drink that people can't spill, otherwise they will feel bad. They wouldn't give me cookies or the drink in this home. I had to go and buy them. And we have in one movie film, it was so awkward, I didn't have time ahead of time because I had 2 little kids. Mrs. Freeman, who was the hostess, had to take the cellophane off because I didn't have time to do it. People that like Mrs. Freeman would be in the middle of welcoming very beautifully, and the nurse would come in and take her out to give her medication or her bath. So this was hard, because if you're working in an institution, you need the support of your administration, and it siphons it all the way down to the nursing aide, who they don't bother to. You need help to bring the people to your group. They don't bother because this isn't important. So that was really what I had a hard time to go through. And then when reality orientation, I had people walk out of my workshops, sent me hate letters, because this reality thing was so, it was like environment, when they had that thing with environment and heredity, it was the same kind of a deep struggle in some people, brought out by Robert Wilson, I think. Well, anyway, that was what was hard. It was, right. But I knew what it was right. I knew that because I knew the people. So that's why I kept going. People have heard of validation because it's been around so long, since 1963, and some of them have seen a film, or a lot of them have seen my workshops. But they really don't know validation because they haven't had training. And I think the interest isn't here. Well, first of all, I think a lot of other people have taken the ideas, because it started so long ago. Like person-centered care, for example, means you care about the person. Well, that's what validation is all about. And that started many, many years ago, say in 63. So a lot of people have taken the ideas of validation and are teaching it, but in a much simpler way, so that people don't have to, if you want to learn validation, you really have to take a course, because it involves empathy and getting into the world of the old person. So if someone says, there's my mother, it's much easier to use what they teach now is redirection, diverting the person and then lying to them. They call it a therapeutic lie. And saying, oh, don't worry, sit down, and your mother will be right back. She's right around the corner. Here, let's play some music. And the person will sit down and play some music, and they'll feel better for a few minutes. But the next 2 minutes, where's my mother? Whereas the validation worker would get into the world of the person and say, you miss your mother. When did you last see her? It would pick up the emotion of the person. And that way the person will trust the validation worker and will say, well, and we'll talk about her mother and see her mother and be with her mother. And a few minutes later, and we have this on movie film, that same old lady will say, my mother died a long time ago, because she needed to express her feelings to her mother, with her mother. And once she trusted the worker, and once she expressed her feelings, she felt much better. So the goal is not that your mother's alive and your mother's dead with validation. The goal is to listen with empathy and reduce the anxiety of the person, and let the person do it themselves. Whereas the goal of these other techniques are to redirect the person, to calm them down right away. And if they're crying, to have them stop crying and feel happy. Well, it's not a bad goal, but people can't just suddenly feel happy. Whereas if a person is crying, the validation worker will say, you're sad. You miss somebody. And the person will cry, and crying is healing. Whereas with the other techniques, they don't want people to cry. So the other techniques calm people down for a few minutes, but they're kind of superficial. Whereas the validation techniques help the person deal with whatever they're needing to deal with. It isn't curing the person, but it's just helping them express themselves so that they feel better. And then they can go have some tea or play music.